Okay, Frank, we're going to talk today about gambling. This might be a big question, and I know that it is not a very long time since the legislation was enacted, but how do you think the introduction or enactment of the Gambling Regulation Act is going, Frank?
I think it's progressing, but progressing slowly. Now, I understand it's a complex area, but we haven't really seen anything tangible yet. My understanding is what's happening at the moment is that the gambling regulator has called for people basically to apply to hold gambling licenses. And I think there's a deadline on that, and I can't remember, is it sort of the 1st of June or 1st of July, but it's quite soon. But maybe once that happens, we can start to hope for more.
It is important to bear in mind, I think, for people interested in this area that and the implications of the Act, is that the Act only came into law about a year and a half ago, didn't it, Frank?
That's right. Yeah, it's a 2024 Act, and it's long overdue. We've had a fairly unregulated sector for an awful long time, so it is a good development. We just need to see it operationalized as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, we do have a gambling regulatory authority of Ireland now, which is, in theory, at least a fantastic idea. I think the authority is still, I think, seemingly very reliant on the industry gambling awareness trust stroke gambling care, isn't it, Frank?
It must be said there do seem to be some links there, and these links are a little bit worrying. We've seen this in tobacco, we see it in alcohol, we're seeing it in gambling. The gambling industry, in this case, is basically promoting what has the official status of a charity, but there's no denying, I don't think, that it's essentially to serve their purposes. And I think if you look at the gambling regulator site at the moment, it does mention Gambling Care, which is one of the groups funded by the Gambling Awareness Trust, which, as I say, is funded by the gambling industry. And that's an issue. And I think they need to break those links. I think one thing we need to remember is the UK had this situation. They had Gamble Aware, which was providing services, and it actually had a formal contract with the National Health Service in the UK. But when they came to renew that contract, there was such a pushback from people using the service that they felt they couldn't sort of continue with that contract. And what worries me, and the timing on this is really quite scary. What worries me is literally within 1, 2, or 3 months of it having been rejected in the UK, what do we see in Ireland? The same sort of thing starts happening in Ireland. I have serious questions. So when they stopped offering those kind of services in the UK, they started offering them in Ireland under the auspices of this sort of Gambling Awareness Trust and Gambling Care. There's a few issues that we need to think about when you have something like the Gambling Awareness Trust or Gambling Care providing services, paying for research. I'll just give you some examples if you don't mind. So one of the things that's happening is that Gambling Care or the Gambling Awareness Trust, I think you can essentially think of them both as the same entity. They've now set up a national problem gambling support service, which my understanding was going to go into 20 family support centres across Ireland. Now, don't get me wrong, we know these services are required, but it's a real issue when it's the gambling industry that are funding them directly. And if you think why, that doesn't make sense. Why would that be? Well, the reason is because it gives the gambling industry a respectability. It gives the gambling industry a legitimacy. It gives them credibility. And to be honest, the gambling industry is part of the addictions industry. It's like tobacco. It's like alcohol. And when it gets this links, it gets a prestige that it shouldn't have, to my mind. Another thing that they're doing is they're funding gambling addiction training. So, for example, I think if you go to MTU, Munster Technological University, you can get 70% of your fees paid while doing a certificate in gambling addiction. Okay. And again, you might say, well, sure, isn't that great? The industry paying back maybe part of its debt. But the important thing to remember here is the industry is worth somewhere in the region 5, 7, 10 billion a year. And they're throwing a pittance at these kind of things that they would probably call corporate social responsibility, that I would call camouflage, that allows them to continue to operate. And another thing that Gambling Care, Gambling Awareness Trust are doing is they're funding research. And this, you know, I work in Technological University of the Shannon, and for me, this really, really rings alarm bells. We've seen it with tobacco. Under the big legal agreements that happened in America, a lot of the industry files, memos, and that came to light. They were required by law to be passed over to the public domain, and we see in there the strategies that these industries use. They fund certain types of research. They fund research that serves their purposes. They fund, maybe, let's take gambling as an example. They fund research on sort of really heavy addiction gambling. Why? Because then it seems like it's only this small, teeny little percentage of the population who have a problem. But we know the problem is much wider than that. The Economic and Social Research Institute did a study just a couple of years ago. And, you know, we only have a population of about 5 million. But they identified something like 170,000 people would count as being problem gamblers. Okay. Sorry, my mistake. That's 130,000. I apologize. 130,000 people as problem gamblers, and 270,000 with problematic gambling. Essentially, we're talking 400,000 people who have some sort of gambling issue, and that shouldn't be glossed over. You know, the industry throwing a little bit of money at these sort of good projects. We can't afford to let that sort of diminish the harmful impact that the industry has.
You were saying there, really gets in your craw about the industry funding research in third level institutions. I can understand that because you work for a third level institution. Personally, what gets in my craw more than anything else, I've been aware of this, is the whole area of going into giving kind of presentations in family resource centres and services, like addiction service. Like if you go to an addiction service because you have an addiction to gambling, you should be encouraged to get off. Like I've heard that the vast majority of people who have a gambling addiction want to stop gambling 100%. You don't want to have gambling as a hobby, as an occasional hobby. But if you go to an addiction service that is funded by the gambling industry, you aren't encouraged to stop gambling 100%. You're encouraged to be able to kind of control your gambling, and from my understanding of addictions, that's not the way addictions work. There's no such thing as being in control of something. Like the whole thing about being an occasional drinker or smoker or gambling, I just, from my understanding of addiction, it doesn't work like that. Do you know what I mean?
I agree. Sorry, I agree absolutely with you. Their message, because remember, it's in their financial interest. Their message is always going to be kind of gamble responsibly, gamble within limits, because they don't want people turning away from gambling. I mean, as well as that, what one thing that I often think, and a phrase that I've started using is what you might call warnertisements. So yes, it's kind of a warning, but it's kind of also an advertisement for their services, you know, their gambling services. So sometimes when I see some of the warnings, the only phrase that comes to my mind is a warnertisement, because they're definitely blending their advertising with their supposed warnings.
I did an interview a couple of years ago with the minister, who was minister of Department of Justice. He's the Minister for Housing now. What's his name? Minister Brown.
Is it James Brown?
James Brown, yeah. He was the Minister of State who was dealing with the introduction of the Gambling Regulation Act. And I did an interview just after the Act had passed all stages of the Oireachtas and was on the way to be signed by President Michael D. Higgins. But he was saying, I asked him this very question as regards who should fund gambling resource centres, or who should fund gambling, problem gambling services in general. Should it be industry or the Gambling Regulatory Authority of Ireland? He said he wants to see the authority funding these services, and he thinks that the levy that's going to come in, I don't know if it's in yet, but the levy that's going to come in will be able to have the funding to be able to fund public services or private services that are not funded by the gambling industry. Is there any word on the levy, Frank? Do you know?
This social impact fund levy is definitely due to come in. I don't imagine it could currently be operational. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see how it could currently be operational because they haven't yet, I don't think, almost got a legal list of who are the industry players in the field, if you know what I mean. I'm sure it is coming in, or maybe it already is in. But I am interested very much in the social impact fund, and I tell you why. One thing that I feel is absolutely crucial is that the industry, the gambling industry, must get absolutely no say or sway in how that money is distributed, how it's spent. I think if there's any, and I mean any, gambling industry influence in those decisions, then we have a very, very tricky situation. That money needs to be basically completely divided and separated from the industry. And if you wonder why is because what you might call addiction services, they need to be able to speak with complete autonomy and authority against gambling, and as well as that, when it comes to research, and we know this from tobacco, we know this from alcohol, the industry will only want certain types of research funded. Okay, and if they have any situation, any sway whatsoever, then they will try and only fund, sort of looking at extreme addiction, maybe never looking at children and this kind of thing. So the social impact fund is important, and I suppose it could be used to fund these services, but only if there is a real divide. But I mean, if we want to fund some of this stuff effectively, why not let's just increase the tax? Let's take it like our regular service. Let's increase the tax on gambling. My understanding is the UK has recently almost doubled the gambling tax on sort of the online casinos. At the moment, I think we're still kicking in at about our VAT rate 23%. I'd like to see that up to 40%, like the UK has done. I think that would be a great way to fund these services.
Okay, we haven't got much longer left, Frank, on the program.
Sure.
But just I'm personally surprised we're even having this conversation, because the way the tobacco industry has gone over the last few decades, really, and even in the last couple of years, the way the alcohol industry has gone with the Public Health Alcohol Act and what happened with Drink Aware in schools a couple of years ago. They're not allowed give presentations in schools anymore. I'm surprised we're having this conversation about gambling, but it's a current issue. And I don't want to talk about a total different other kind of area, even though it's some way connected. But it's not we shouldn't be maybe I think naive in thinking that gambling is the only industry, like addiction industry like this in the world or the Western world, because in a lot of countries in the Western world now, you're even seeing problems with cannabis legalization, aren't you? And cannabis is also an addictive drug, so it's a big business kind of a thing, isn't it, Frank? I think. Do you think, Frank?
Absolutely, yeah. We tend to use the phrase the addiction industry. So obviously you've got gambling, you've got tobacco, you've got alcohol. As you say, we've got cannabis. I used to live in Washington State, where cannabis was legal. So yeah, it's definitely an issue. And also fast food. I mean, they're all effectively addiction industries. They're all doing their best to market themselves and their products the best way they can. And every time the governments sort of introduce an act, they inevitably start to exploit the loopholes in the act, and they use their sort of what you might call soft power, soft pressure, to influence the legislation, to try and delay it, to deny there's a problem, to defer the implementation. I mean, just take the Alcohol Act that you just mentioned. I mean, that was passed in 2018. We were due now, this 2026, 8 years later, we were due to see the introduction of the alcohol warning labels, which would importantly have included the cancer link. Lots of people don't know there's a link between alcohol and cancer, but there is. The industry has done really, really well in keeping that secret. We were due to have that come into force now, but the industry has managed to delay it by at least 2 years. So, when you're talking about these industries, they do work together and they basically use the same playbook.
Yeah. Just to come towards our end of our interview, Frank, I didn't want to deflect too much there, talking about like the big kind of international picture, because we're talking really about Ireland, and because we have legislation now, the Gambling Regulation Act only came in a year and a half ago, so. And the Gambling Regulatory Authority of Ireland are only, I think they were established before the Act came in for a year or two, but they didn't have because the Act wasn't enacted, they didn't have their full power. So it is likely, I think, is it, Frank, that over the next year and few years, we will hear a lot more about the Gambling Regulatory Authority of Ireland, because they will have more power and resources. Do you think? Do you think, Frank?
Absolutely, yes. What we would anticipate and what we hope for is that they'll start to roll out some of their controls as quick as possible. I mean, at the moment, we're just bombarded with gambling ads, particularly on social media. And that it will be great to start to see some sort of controls around that. But I think the important thing to remember is the Gambling Regulation Authority has teeth. What we it has powers. What we need to see is it willing to use them. If you read the legislation, oh my God, it's almost like they can, if they find someone in breach of the act, they can lock them up, throw away the key, charge them 20 million, all this kind of stuff. But what we know in Ireland is there's very, very poor enforcement of the legislation. I've been involved in some research recently. We looked at the enforcement for the Alcohol Act. We looked at, I think it was about 4 years data or something like that. There's been no fines, no prosecutions, despite thousands of breaches of the Act. When you look at tobacco, the breach rate is quite high. It's about 20% of premises visited. But would you believe that the percentage who are actually prosecuted when they've been found to be in breach is about 1.2%. So we've got this gambling regulator. We should be hearing more about them. Let's hope they have the courage to use the teeth that they've got to actually control the industry.